Sometimes the biggest mistake you ever make opens the only door you were truly meant to walk through. Ethan Carter had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without breaking a sweat, but on that crisp October afternoon in Manhattan, nothing prepared him for what waited behind the polished walnut door of Penthouse 47A. The private elevator chimed softly before sliding open, revealing a foyer washed in warm afternoon sunlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Hudson River. The scent wasn't fresh paint or expensive leather like every newly purchased luxury property he had ever visited. It was vanilla, cinnamon, and something homemade. He stopped. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, looked up at him with wide blue eyes. "Daddy, somebody's here." Ethan frowned, tightening his grip on the envelope containing the closing documents. His attorney had confirmed the purchase barely 2 hours earlier. Every signature had been verified. Every wire transfer completed. Every legal detail finalized. There should have been no surprises. Yet soft piano music drifted through the enormous living room, accompanied by the gentle scratching of a paintbrush against canvas. Ethan stepped farther inside, his expensive Italian shoes making almost no sound against the polished oak floor. Nothing looked abandoned. Fresh flowers rested on the dining table. A knitted blanket was folded neatly across the cream-colored sofa. Children's storybooks sat beside a steaming mug of tea. It didn't feel like an empty penthouse. It felt like someone's home. Then a young woman emerged from the hallway carrying a small tray with 2 mugs. She wore an oversized cream sweater flecked with tiny drops of dried paint, faded blue jeans, and her chestnut hair was loosely gathered behind her shoulders. She couldn't have been older than 27. She smiled without hesitation, the kind of smile reserved for someone familiar. "Oh," she said warmly. "You're home earlier than I expected." The words settled over the room like a puzzle no one knew how to solve. Ethan blinked once. Lily looked from the woman to her father. The woman noticed the little girl first. "Hi there," she said. Gently. "You must be freezing outside. Would you like some hot chocolate? I just made a fresh batch." Lily instinctively glanced toward her father for permission. Ethan didn't answer. His mind raced through contracts, addresses, and closing statements, searching for the flaw that simply couldn't exist. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice calm but cautious. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The woman's smile faded into confusion. "Misunderstanding? This penthouse belongs to me." Silence followed. Not an angry silence. A bewildered one. She slowly placed the tray onto the marble kitchen island before walking toward a narrow entry table. From a small leather folder, she removed a set of keys and a stack of neatly organized documents. "Actually," she replied softly, "this is my home." Ethan carefully unfolded his own paperwork, placing it beside hers. 2 addresses. 2 ownership records. 2 official seals. Both bearing Penthouse 47A. Both appearing completely legitimate. Lily leaned closer, whispering just loudly enough for both adults to hear. "Daddy, how can 2 people own the same house?" Ethan had spent years believing money solved every problem because money usually bought certainty. But standing there beneath the golden light of a Manhattan sunset, facing a stranger whose honest eyes reflected the exact same confusion he felt, certainty quietly slipped away. For the first time in years, the billionaire who owned skyscrapers across America had absolutely no idea what to do next. Neither Ethan nor the young woman spoke for several long seconds. The quiet hum of the city drifted through the glass walls while the fading sunlight painted the living room in shades of amber and gold. Lily slowly stepped closer to the kitchen island, studying the 2 stacks of documents lying side by side. They looked almost identical. The same address. The same legal stamps. The same elegant signatures. Only the names were different. Ethan carefully picked up the woman's paperwork without crossing the line of courtesy. "May I?" he asked. She nodded once. "Of course." Her voice remained calm, although her fingers tightened around the edge of her sweater. Ethan examined every page with the practiced precision that had built his business empire. Nothing looked forged. Nothing looked suspicious. Every document appeared authentic. That impossible realization unsettled him far more than if someone had attempted an obvious scam. "My name is Ethan Carter," he finally said, extending his hand. "I purchased this property through Hamilton Premier Realty this morning." The woman accepted the handshake with quiet confidence. "Grace Bennett. I moved here almost 6 months ago." Ethan looked at her, searching for any sign of deception. Instead, he saw exhaustion hidden beneath kindness, the kind of tiredness that came from carrying responsibilities rather than secrets. Lily tilted her head. "If you already lived here, why did someone sell it to us?" Grace let out a soft breath. "I wish I knew." Ethan immediately called his attorney. The phone rang twice before Michael Dawson answered. "Congratulations again, Ethan. Have you made it upstairs?" "Michael," Ethan interrupted, "someone is already living here." Silence. "That is impossible. She has paperwork." Another pause followed. Ethan could almost hear pages being shuffled on the other end of the line. "Stay there," Michael said. "Do not leave. I am contacting the title company immediately." Ethan lowered the phone. Grace quietly poured the untouched hot chocolate into 2 mugs and slid one toward Lily. "It is getting cold," she said gently. "You do not have to drink it if your father says no." Lily looked toward Ethan once more. He hesitated only briefly before giving a small nod. "Thank you," Lily whispered with a shy smile. Grace smiled back without saying another word. The simple exchange caught Ethan off guard. Most people reacted to his daughter with curiosity because of who her father was. Grace did not ask questions. She did not seem impressed by expensive clothes or luxury surroundings. She treated Lily like any child who happened to be standing in her kitchen. 20 minutes later the penthouse door opened again. Michael Dawson entered alongside a representative from the building management office. Both men wore expressions that shifted from confidence to complete disbelief as soon as they saw Grace standing comfortably beside the living room windows. "Miss Bennett," the manager asked. "You still live here?" Grace answered politely. "Yes." He turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Carter, according to our records, your ownership was registered this afternoon." He then looked back at Grace. "But according to our resident files, Miss Bennett has legally occupied this unit since April." Michael adjusted his glasses repeatedly while reviewing both sets of documents. "This should not be possible," he murmured. The title insurance cleared. The deed transferred. Every database confirmed the property was vacant. Grace quietly disappeared down the hallway and returned carrying a small metal box. Inside were utility bills, maintenance receipts, delivery records, and dozens of ordinary documents collected over months of daily life. Every date matched. Every address matched. Every receipt placed her inside Penthouse 47 long before Ethan had ever signed a contract. Michael slowly closed the box. "I have practiced real estate law for 28 years, he admitted. "I have never seen anything like this." Evening settled over Manhattan as thousands of city lights flickered awake beyond the glass walls. No one argued anymore. There was nothing left to argue about. The facts contradicted each other so perfectly that even the law could not immediately decide who belonged there. Finally, the building manager cleared his throat. "Until we discover what happened, neither of you should leave the property. Legally, I cannot force either resident out tonight." Ethan looked across the room at Grace. She met his eyes with the same quiet uncertainty. Somewhere inside the vast penthouse, the grandfather clock chimed 7 gentle notes, and for the first time, both of them realized that complete strangers might have no choice except to share the same home. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale silver light as the first rays of sunrise stretched across the Manhattan skyline. Ethan had barely slept. The guest suite assigned to him still smelled of fresh linen and unopened furniture polish, yet nothing about the night had felt temporary anymore. Every few hours he had awakened, reminding himself that somewhere beyond the hallway a complete stranger was sleeping in what he believed had become his home only yesterday. Downstairs, the city was already alive. Yellow taxis moved like streams of gold between skyscrapers while ferries traced slow white lines across the Hudson River. Ethan buttoned his shirt, checked his phone, and found 6 unanswered messages from attorneys, 3 from his executive assistant, and 2 from members of his board asking whether the purchase had been finalized. For the first time in years, he ignored every one of them. As he stepped into the kitchen, he stopped. Grace stood quietly beside the stove flipping blueberry pancakes while soft jazz floated from a small speaker resting near the window. The rich aroma of coffee blended with butter and maple syrup, making the enormous penthouse feel surprisingly ordinary. Lily was already sitting at the island wearing oversized pajamas, carefully arranging fresh strawberries into the shape of a smiling face on her plate. "Good morning," Grace said naturally without turning around. "I hope blueberry is all right." It was the only fruit I had besides bananas. Ethan hesitated before answering. "You did not have to make breakfast." Grace smiled gently. "I know. I wanted to." Lily looked up with syrup already decorating one corner of her smile. "Daddy, she makes pancakes with little blueberries inside instead of on top. They taste better." Ethan could not remember the last time his daughter had sounded that cheerful before 8 o'clock in the morning. Usually breakfast happened inside the back seat of a chauffeured SUV between conference calls and school drop-offs. Today she was laughing over pancakes in a kitchen that none of them completely understood belonged to. Grace placed a warm plate in front of Ethan. "There is fresh coffee too." He looked at the meal for a moment before quietly saying, "Thank you." It felt like an unusually small phrase for a man accustomed to signing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. During breakfast the conversation stayed simple. Lily talked about her art class. Grace asked what kind of books she liked reading. Ethan mostly listened. He noticed how naturally Grace encouraged Lily to finish her fruit without sounding demanding. She listened carefully whenever Lily spoke, never interrupting, never pretending to be interested. She genuinely was. After breakfast Grace carried her dishes toward the sink. Lily immediately stood beside her. "Can I help?" Grace laughed softly. "Only if you promise not to splash water everywhere." "I cannot promise that." Both of them laughed together. Ethan watched from across the room, feeling something unfamiliar settle quietly inside him. It was not relief. It was not happiness. It was recognition. His late wife had always believed that homes were built around ordinary mornings rather than extraordinary moments. Somehow, despite the impossible circumstances, this kitchen felt more like a family breakfast than the silent penthouse suites Ethan had lived in since becoming a widower. Around mid-morning Michael Dawson called again. His voice sounded unusually strained. "We still have no answers," he admitted. "The title company insists the transaction is legitimate. Building management insists Miss Bennett's residency is legitimate. Every database supports both claims." Ethan stared through the glass toward the river. "So what happens now?" "Investigators need several days. Possibly longer." Ethan lowered the phone slowly. Across the room Grace sat near the windows painting quietly while Lily watched with complete fascination. Bright morning sunlight illuminated dozens of tiny flecks of color across the canvas. "Can you teach me?" Lily asked hopefully. Grace looked toward Ethan first, silently asking permission. Ethan met her eyes for only a moment before giving a gentle nod. Grace smiled. "I would love to." Lily hurried to the chair beside her, carefully dipping a small brush into pale blue paint. Ethan remained standing where he was. The legal mess remained unsolved. The ownership remained uncertain. But as laughter quietly replaced yesterday's confusion, something inside the enormous penthouse began changing in a way no contract, no title search, and no billionaire could have ever predicted. 3 days passed without answers. Every morning began with another phone call from lawyers, another apology from the title company, and another promise that the investigation was making progress. Yet every evening ended exactly the same way. Ethan, Lily, and Grace returned to the same penthouse, sharing the same kitchen, the same living room, and the same unanswered questions. Somewhere along the way, the awkwardness began quietly disappearing. Grace had a way of making ordinary moments feel meaningful without ever trying to impress anyone. She left handwritten notes beside Lily's breakfast that simply read, "Good luck on your spelling quiz," or, "Do not forget how brave you are." She watered the small herbs growing beside the kitchen windows every afternoon. She always opened the balcony doors for a few minutes before sunset because she said fresh air reminded her that every difficult day eventually ended. Ethan noticed everything, even though he rarely mentioned it. On Thursday evening he returned from a meeting carrying several expensive shopping bags. Lily ran toward him with excitement, but Grace simply looked up from the dining table where she was sketching another landscape. "Long day?" she asked. "Very." Ethan placed the bags on the counter. "I brought dinner." Grace peeked inside one of the bags before smiling politely. "That must have cost a fortune." Ethan shrugged. "It is from one of the best restaurants in the city." Grace closed her sketchbook. "I already started making chicken soup." Ethan looked toward the stove where a large pot simmered quietly, filling the room with the comforting aroma of rosemary, garlic, carrots, and fresh thyme. "You should have told me." She laughed softly. "You never asked." Lily leaned over the pot with curious eyes. "It smells better than fancy restaurant food." Ethan almost smiled. "You have not even tasted either one." "I do not need to," Lily answered confidently. "Soup smells like home." The simple sentence lingered in the room long after everyone sat down for dinner. Ethan found himself choosing Grace's homemade soup over the expensive meal he had purchased without thinking. It tasted honest. Warm. Familiar. Like something money could never order. Later that evening Ethan noticed Grace standing alone on the balcony wrapped in a light sweater as the skyline shimmered beneath thousands of lights. He stepped outside with 2 mugs of hot tea. "Chamomile," he said. "I was told it helps people sleep." Grace accepted the mug with a grateful smile. "Thank you." They stood quietly for several moments, listening to distant ferry horns drifting across the river. Finally Ethan asked the question that had stayed in his mind for days. "You never asked what I do for a living." Grace looked genuinely surprised. "Should I have?" "Most people do." She took another sip of tea before answering. "People spend too much time asking what someone does instead of asking who they are." Ethan looked at her carefully. Boardrooms, interviews, and charity galas had taught him to recognize rehearsed kindness. Grace did not sound rehearsed. She sounded sincere. "You are different," he admitted. Grace smiled toward the city lights instead of toward him. Everybody is different if someone takes enough time to notice. Inside the penthouse Lily sat cross-legged on the living room rug surrounded by crayons and colored paper. She had been unusually quiet for nearly an hour. Finally she walked onto the balcony holding a folded sheet of paper behind her back. "I made something." Grace knelt so they were eye level. Lily handed her the drawing with shy pride. It showed 3 people standing together beneath a bright orange sunset inside a tall apartment with enormous windows. Above them she had written in careful handwriting, "My favorite people." Grace's eyes softened immediately. "This is beautiful." Lily looked at Ethan. "Can we hang it on the refrigerator?" Ethan stared at the drawing longer than he intended. His daughter had not drawn a family picture since her mother passed away. Without saying a word, he nodded. Grace carefully taped the picture onto the stainless steel refrigerator door. It fluttered gently each time someone opened it, a simple drawing made with crayons that somehow carried more value than every piece of expensive artwork hanging throughout the luxurious penthouse. Ethan looked at it one last time before turning away, unaware that somewhere down the hallway one locked door held a secret that would soon change everything he believed about Grace Bennett. Friday arrived with steady autumn rain tapping softly against the towering glass walls, turning the city beyond into a watercolor of silver streets and blurred lights. Ethan had cancelled every meeting for the afternoon after Michael Dawson warned him that investigators still needed more time. It was the first uninterrupted Friday he had spent with Lily in nearly 4 years, and he intended to enjoy every minute of it. Lily sat at the dining table painting beside Grace, who patiently demonstrated how small strokes of color could slowly become rolling hills, quiet lakes, and distant mountains. Ethan watched them from the living room while pretending to read financial reports. Every few minutes Lily laughed, and every laugh pulled his attention away from the numbers. Grace never corrected Lily's mistakes immediately. Instead, she would smile and say, "What do you think this painting wants to become?" Somehow that simple question always encouraged Lily to keep trying. Around noon Grace excused herself. "I need a few minutes," she said, setting down her brush. "Please do not wait for lunch. I will be right back." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly, but his eyes followed her as she disappeared down the hallway carrying a small wooden box under one arm. A quiet click echoed through the apartment. A door closed. Lily looked toward the hallway. "She always goes in that room." Ethan glanced at his daughter. "Which room?" "The one at the end." Lily lowered her voice as though sharing an important secret. "She keeps it locked all the time." Ethan frowned slightly. During the past several days he had walked past that hallway countless times. The final door had always remained shut. He had assumed it was simply a storage room. Now curiosity settled into his thoughts. Nearly an hour passed. Grace still had not returned. Ethan stood to refill his coffee when he noticed the hallway door standing slightly open. Perhaps the latch had not fully caught. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to respect her privacy. Yet another instinct, the one sharpened by decades of negotiating complicated business deals, quietly reminded him that unanswered questions often hid important truths. He walked slowly down the hallway. The apartment remained silent except for the distant rhythm of rainfall against the windows. As he reached the doorway, he gently knocked. "Grace?" No answer came. He pushed the door open only a few inches. His breath caught almost instantly. It was not a bedroom. It was an art studio. Sunlight filtered through a large skylight above, illuminating dozens of finished paintings arranged carefully around the room. Massive canvases leaned against every wall. Smaller sketches covered long wooden tables. The scent of linseed oil and fresh paint filled the air. Ethan stepped inside almost without realizing it. Then he stopped completely. Every painting portrayed the same man. Sometimes standing alone beside the ocean. Sometimes sitting quietly on a park bench with a little girl. Sometimes smiling faintly while holding a child's hand beneath falling autumn leaves. Ethan stared in disbelief. The man in every painting was unmistakably him. His charcoal overcoat. His silver wristwatch. His thoughtful expression. Even the small scar near his right eyebrow had been captured with astonishing precision. None of the portraits looked exaggerated or idealized. They looked deeply personal, as though painted by someone who had spent years studying moments no one else had noticed. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He had never posed for Grace. He had never even met her before entering the penthouse days earlier. How could she possibly know these details? His eyes drifted toward one unfinished canvas resting alone near the window. It showed Ethan kneeling beside Lily while tying her shoelaces outside an elementary school. Rain puddles reflected the morning sky. Lily was laughing. Ethan suddenly remembered that exact morning nearly 7 months earlier. He had believed no one had been watching. Behind him came a quiet voice. I was hoping you would never have to see this room until I could explain. Ethan slowly turned around. Grace stood in the doorway, her expression calm but undeniably sad. She was not angry that he had entered. She looked disappointed only because the truth had arrived before she was ready to tell it. Ethan searched her face for answers. Grace, he whispered, unable to hide his confusion, how do you know my life well enough to paint moments that no one else even remembers? Grace remained quietly in the doorway, holding the small wooden box against her chest as though it contained something far more fragile than paintbrushes and pencils. The rain continued tapping softly against the skylight, filling the silence neither of them seemed ready to break. Ethan looked once more at the unfinished portrait of himself tying Lily's shoelaces. You were there, he said almost to himself. Grace gave a slow nod. Not close enough for you to notice. That was never my intention. Ethan struggled to understand. Why would you paint someone you never knew? Grace stepped farther into the studio and carefully placed the wooden box on a weathered work table. She opened it, revealing dozens of neatly folded letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Some had yellowed with age. Others looked almost new. Resting on top was an old black and white photograph of an elderly gentleman standing beside the very same penthouse windows years earlier. Grace gently picked up the photograph. This is Arthur Bennett, she said. My grandfather. Ethan studied the picture. The name meant nothing to him, yet something about the man's warm smile felt strangely familiar. Grace continued softly. He bought this penthouse almost 30 years ago, long before the towers around us changed the skyline. He believed homes should always shelter people who had forgotten what hope looked like. Ethan listened without interrupting. After my parents passed away, he raised me here. Every Sunday morning we would sit beside these windows with pancakes and hot chocolate. He would watch people crossing the park below and tell me that the richest people were never the ones with the largest bank accounts. They were the ones whose kindness could not be purchased. Grace smiled faintly at the memory before her expression grew quieter. About a year before he died, he became too weak to leave the apartment. So I would walk through the neighborhood every afternoon, sketching whatever caught my attention. Most drawings lasted only a few minutes before I threw them away. She picked up another painting and handed it to Ethan. It showed him kneeling beside an elderly homeless man on a cold winter afternoon, quietly sharing 2 cups of coffee. Ethan remembered the moment immediately. He had never told anyone about it. Grandfather saw this painting, Grace said. He asked who the man was. I told him I had no idea. I had only seen someone treating a stranger with dignity when nobody else stopped. She reached into the wooden box again and unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting trembled slightly across the page. He asked me to keep watching, she whispered. Not because you were wealthy. We did not even know your name then. He said character reveals itself in ordinary moments when nobody is trying to impress anyone. Ethan felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. Grace looked around the studio filled with portraits. Every few weeks I happen to see you somewhere in the city. Always with Lily. Always doing small things most people never noticed. Helping her tie her shoes. Waiting patiently outside her music lessons. Sitting beside her after she scraped her knee in Central Park. You looked lonely. But never bitter. Ethan lowered his eyes. I did not know anyone was watching. You were not being watched, Grace answered gently. You were being remembered. She unfolded one final letter, carefully smoothing the paper with both hands. A few days before grandfather passed away, he made me promise something. Her voice nearly disappeared into the quiet rhythm of the rain. He told me this home should never belong to the person with the highest offer. It should belong to someone who understood what a home truly meant. Ethan looked toward the elderly man's photograph once again. Grace carefully handed him the final page. At the bottom, Arthur Bennett had written one sentence in shaky handwriting. "If the man from the paintings ever finds his way to this home, tell him I believed kindness would bring him here long before money ever could." Ethan stared at the words in complete silence, suddenly realizing that whatever had gone wrong with the ownership of the penthouse no longer felt like an accident at all. The letter remained in Ethan's hands long after Grace quietly left the studio. He stood alone beneath the skylight while rain continued washing across the glass above, reading Arthur Bennett's final words over and over until they no longer felt like ink on paper. They felt like a question. Had every hurried morning, every unnoticed act of kindness, every ordinary decision somehow led him here without his ever realizing it? That evening the penthouse was unusually quiet. Lily had fallen asleep on the living room sofa with one of Grace's sketchbooks resting gently across her lap. Half-finished drawings of birds, city parks, and little boats drifting along quiet water surrounded her like small dreams waiting to be colored. Grace carefully covered Lily with a soft blanket before turning off the nearby lamp. Ethan watched from across the room. "She trusts you," he said softly. Grace smiled without looking up. Children usually know who makes them feel safe before adults do. Ethan wanted to answer, but his phone vibrated across the kitchen counter. Michael Dawson's name appeared on the screen. Ethan stepped onto the balcony before accepting the call. "We finally found something," Michael said immediately. "Not the ownership issue yet, but another piece of the puzzle." Ethan leaned against the railing as cool evening air drifted across the city. "Go on." Arthur Bennett updated his estate documents 2 years before he passed away. Most of the records were straightforward, but one supplemental file disappeared from the courthouse archives months before the property was listed for sale. Ethan frowned. "Disappeared?" "Someone intentionally removed it. We have already confirmed it should still exist." Ethan looked through the balcony doors toward Grace, who was quietly cleaning paintbrushes in the kitchen as though nothing extraordinary had happened that day. "Who benefits if those papers vanish?" Michael hesitated. "That is exactly what worries me." The call ended without answers, leaving only more questions than before. The following morning Ethan traveled to headquarters for the first board meeting he had attended all week. The glass conference room overlooked Midtown Manhattan, filled with executives accustomed to discussing numbers instead of people. Before the meeting even began, one director slid a financial report across the polished table. "The penthouse transaction has become a liability," he said. "If ownership remains disputed, the simplest solution is to challenge the current occupant immediately." Another executive nodded. "Offer her a generous settlement. If she refuses, pursue every legal option available." Ethan remained silent. They continued speaking. "The media cannot discover that our chief executive is sharing a residence with a stranger. Investors will ask questions. This should end quickly. Protect the company first." Ethan slowly closed the report in front of him. "What if she has done nothing wrong?" The room grew noticeably quieter. One executive adjusted his glasses. "That is unfortunate, but business decisions cannot depend on feelings." Ethan looked around the table at faces he had known for years. Normally he would have agreed without hesitation. Efficiency had built his fortune. Speed had built his reputation. Yet every argument sounded strangely empty after sharing breakfasts with Grace and watching Lily laugh more in 1 week than she had in months. "She has legal documents," Ethan said calmly. "She has every reason to believe that apartment belongs to her." "Then buy her another one," someone suggested. Ethan shook his head. "You cannot solve every problem by writing a larger check." Several executives exchanged surprised glances. Those words did not sound like the Ethan Carter they had always known. After the meeting ended, Ethan remained alone in the conference room watching clouds drift between the skyscrapers. His reflection stared back from the glass. For years he had measured success by acquisitions, profits, and properties. Arthur Bennett had measured it differently. Grace lived it differently. Lily seemed happiest because of it. When Ethan returned home that evening carrying nothing but a small bouquet of fresh white daisies from a neighborhood flower stand, Grace looked genuinely confused. "What are those for?" she asked. Ethan placed the flowers into a simple glass vase on the kitchen table. "You once said homes are built from ordinary moments." Grace smiled softly. "I said fresh air helped difficult days." Ethan laughed quietly for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Then maybe flowers help too." Grace looked at the daisies for a long moment before whispering, "My grandfather always brought those home on Fridays." Neither of them noticed that somewhere far away, hidden inside forgotten legal records and missing estate documents, a carefully concealed truth was finally beginning to surface. Monday morning arrived with a sky as clear as polished glass, but inside Ethan's office the atmosphere felt heavier than it had in years. Michael Dawson entered carrying a thick binder instead of his usual leather portfolio. Without saying a word, he placed it on Ethan's desk and opened it to a page marked with bright yellow tabs. "We found the missing records," he said quietly. Ethan looked up immediately. "How?" "Someone made a mistake." Michael adjusted his glasses before continuing. "A retired county archivist remembered processing a duplicate filing almost 2 years ago. The original supplemental estate document was never destroyed. It had simply been misplaced inside another probate case." Ethan leaned forward as Michael carefully slid several certified copies across the desk. At the center was Arthur Bennett's final estate amendment, signed, witnessed, and fully notarized. Ethan read every line slowly. The amendment did not transfer ownership of the penthouse to Grace. It did something even more unusual. Arthur had established a charitable residential trust designed to preserve the penthouse until a special review board determined that both Grace Bennett and one unnamed future beneficiary had fulfilled the moral conditions described in his personal letter. Ethan looked up in disbelief. "Unnamed?" Michael nodded. Arthur intentionally refused to identify the second person. Instead, he described character rather than identity. Ethan continued reading. The beneficiary was described as a widowed parent who consistently demonstrated quiet compassion without seeking recognition, someone who valued dignity over status and family over reputation. Ethan slowly lowered the papers. The description felt uncomfortably familiar. "There is more," Michael added. The trust could only be activated if both individuals occupied the residence at the same time. Ethan looked toward the skyline beyond his office windows. "Meaning none of this happened by accident." "Exactly." Michael took a slow breath. Someone knew about the trust and tried to prevent it from taking effect by removing the amendment before the property entered the market. Without that document, the penthouse would have been sold permanently and the trust would disappear. Ethan remained silent. Every impossible event suddenly formed a complete picture. That afternoon Michael arranged an emergency meeting with the trust administrators, the title company, and building management. Grace sat quietly beside Ethan inside the conference room, looking just as overwhelmed as he felt. Lily waited outside with one of the assistants, happily coloring another picture without understanding that the future of their unusual home was being decided only a few feet away. The senior trustee folded his hands before speaking. Arthur Bennett believed wealth should protect character rather than replace it. His final wish was unconventional, but completely lawful. He carefully slid the original amendment across the polished table. Miss Bennett fulfilled her responsibility by preserving the home exactly as Arthur requested. Mr. Carter fulfilled his responsibility without ever knowing he was being observed. Grace looked down at the papers, tears quietly gathering in her eyes. "He never told me there was another person." The trustee smiled gently. "He believed that if he told either of you, kindness might become performance instead of character." Ethan understood immediately. Arthur had never wanted perfection. He had simply trusted ordinary goodness to reveal itself over time. One final document remained unsigned. The trustee placed it in front of Ethan. "You have one decision left." Ethan read the page carefully. The trust allowed him to assume sole ownership immediately if he wished. It was perfectly legal. Perfectly profitable. Perfectly simple. Grace quietly looked away, prepared to accept whatever happened next. Ethan reached for the pen. Everyone in the room watched. Instead of signing the ownership transfer, he crossed out his own name and wrote something else beneath it. Joint stewardship. Equal responsibility. Equal rights. The trustee looked at him with visible surprise. "You understand that this means neither of you may sell the property for personal profit." Ethan smiled calmly. "Then it will never become just another asset." Grace stared at the amended signature before looking at Ethan. "Why would you do that?" Ethan thought about Lily's laughter echoing through the kitchen, Arthur's handwritten letter, the pancakes, the soup, the paintings, and every ordinary moment that had quietly changed his understanding of success. "Because your grandfather was right," he answered softly. "A home is worth protecting only when everyone inside it belongs." The trustee closed the folder with a satisfied smile. Outside the conference room, Lily ran toward them carrying her newest drawing. This time the picture showed not 3 people beneath the apartment windows, but 4. An elderly man stood smiling beside them beneath a sky filled with bright morning light, as though somewhere beyond memory, Arthur Bennett had been watching the entire journey exactly as he had always hoped. Autumn slowly gave way to winter, and the view beyond the towering windows transformed one quiet morning as the first snowfall drifted gently across Manhattan. The city seemed softer beneath fresh white rooftops, as though even the busiest streets had decided to slow down for a little while. Inside the penthouse, the scent of cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen long before sunrise. Grace stood by the oven wearing the same oversized cream sweater Lily insisted was her lucky baking sweater. Lily carefully dusted flour across the counter with far more enthusiasm than accuracy, leaving tiny white fingerprints everywhere she reached. Ethan walked into the kitchen carrying 4 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. One he quietly placed beneath Arthur Bennett's framed photograph, which now rested on a small wooden shelf overlooking the living room. It had become an unspoken tradition every Saturday morning. No one explained it anymore. They simply smiled, poured the extra mug, and began breakfast together. Weeks passed, and something remarkable happened without any grand announcement. Ethan stopped measuring time by quarterly earnings reports and began measuring it by piano lessons, family dinners, and Sunday walks through Central Park. Lily no longer rushed through breakfast because there was always enough time for one more story before school. Grace's paintings slowly filled the once empty walls, replacing expensive abstract artwork that had never meant anything to anyone living there. Visitors often admired the collection, assuming the portraits had been commissioned by wealthy collectors. They never guessed the greatest masterpiece was not hanging on the walls at all. It was the quiet life unfolding inside the apartment itself. Ethan still led his company, but people around him noticed subtle changes. Employees who had once feared entering his office now found him listening more than speaking. New family support programs quietly appeared throughout the company. Flexible schedules became available for single parents. Scholarships were created in Arthur Bennett's name for young artists who lacked financial opportunities. No press conference announced these decisions. Ethan preferred it that way. Grace once asked why he never mentioned the charitable programs during interviews. He simply smiled. The best things people do rarely need applause. She recognized those words immediately. They sounded exactly like something Arthur would have said. One snowy afternoon, Lily came home carrying a sealed envelope from school. "Daddy," she called excitedly. "We had to write an essay about heroes." Ethan laughed. "Who did you choose?" Lily carefully unfolded the paper and began reading aloud. A hero is someone who helps people even when nobody is watching. Heroes do not always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear paint on their sweaters. Sometimes they carry briefcases. Sometimes they make pancakes. Sometimes they tie little girls' shoes before school. Heroes make places feel like home. Grace quietly looked toward the window, blinking away unexpected tears while Ethan placed one gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. There was nothing left to add. The essay had already said everything that truly mattered. That evening the three of them stood together on the balcony watching snowflakes drift between the glowing lights of the city. Ethan glanced toward Grace. "Do you ever think your grandfather planned all of this?" Grace smiled softly. "I think he believed kindness has a way of finding kindness. The rest was simply patience." Lily slipped one hand into Ethan's and the other into Grace's without saying a word. Neither adult moved. Below them, thousands of strangers hurried through another busy New York night, each carrying their own hopes, worries, and unfinished stories. High above the streets, inside the home that had once been the center of confusion, silence settled comfortably around three grateful hearts. The penthouse had never been the miracle. The contracts had never been the treasure. The money had never been the answer. A widowed father had discovered that love could quietly return without asking permission. A young woman had learned that promises kept with kindness could outlive those who first made them. A little girl had found laughter again where grief had once lived. And somewhere beyond what human eyes could see, perhaps an elderly man looked upon the warm lights glowing behind those familiar windows and smiled, knowing that the greatest inheritance he had ever left behind was never a beautiful apartment overlooking the city. It was the simple belief that dignity, compassion, second chances, and ordinary acts of goodness could still build a family where none had existed before.